Good morning. Well, this is the day that many of you have been looking forward to, perhaps all. And I suppose, if I'm honest, even I am looking forward to the last lecture of the semester. So here we are. This is To Have and Have Not, Part 2. And it's my collection of my thoughts on the economic situation in the United States in the late 19th century and the issues there that gave rise to a new kind of Democratic Party. We'll get to that in just a minute, but before we do, I thought I would read a few of the verses from Proverbs chapter 22. Now, these are not consecutive verses. I've picked and chose them. Nevertheless, they are all in Proverbs 22, and I think you'll find that they deal with the theme of today's lecture. So the author of Proverbs wrote, "He who is generous will be blessed, for he gives some of his food to the poor. He who oppresses the poor to make more for himself, or who gives to the rich, perhaps to impress them or to curry favors, will only come to poverty." And finally, "Do not rob the poor because he is poor." In other words, don't look down on him because he is weak and can't really do anything about it. "Do not crush the afflicted at the gate, for the Lord will plead their case and take the life of those who rob them." The word of the Lord. To have and have not. In 1892, farmers and representatives from labor and reform groups met in Omaha, Nebraska to adopt a party platform and choose candidates. So this is the Populist Party, the party that I spoke of near the end of our last lecture. Rise of a third party in the United States is not uncommon, and it occurs when a significant portion of the American people are not happy with the two prevailing parties. Ignatius Donnelly of Minnesota, one of those agricultural states, spoke to the delegates in the moralistic style that was common in the Populist Party. He said, "We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, legislatures, Congress, and the courts. And this was a corrupt age. There can be no question about this. Even the newspapers are subsidized by the wealthy. Meanwhile, homes are covered with mortgages, labor impoverished, and the land is concentrated in the hands of capitalists. A vast conspiracy against mankind has been organized. If not met at once, the establishment of an absolute despotism is coming." And so the evil for Donnelly and the Populists were the great malefactors of wealth in their minds. That is, Wall Street and those politicians who supported Wall Street, the great banks, the great wealth in the United States. Now, this is what the Populists thought. American history, the reality is not that simple, but there was some truth to this. The platform of the party demanded the minting of silver. This is the 16-to-1 issue of adding silver to the gold supply, and an increase in the amount of money in circulation. Remember, there was about $27 per American in circulation at this time, and had been going down. And this caused deflation of prices, which put the vice, so to speak, on farmers and, frankly, other lower class Americans. So this party platform was demanding an increase in the amount of money in circulation in the United States to $50 per person, or about double what there was at this time. This would be highly inflationary. Prices would go up, but the hope was that that incomes for farmers and small business people, and of course, wages would go up as well. The party also sought adoption of, and this is very important because almost every one of these things will become law at some point in the future, but not just at this time in the 1890s. So keep track of what the populists want, and then we'll see the direction then of the populist/progressive movement in the United States in the early 20th century. And if you were to go on into another upper division class, my America in the Time of the Two World Wars, we would pick up this, this development. So number one, the sub-treasury plan, and that featured low interest loans. So it would be possible for a farmer to get a federal loan at a very low interest rate. And then government warehouses across the country to buy and store the excess crops that were driving the price down, and thus create an artificial scarcity. And then the agricultural goods would be released to the market when the price had arisen. This is exactly what Herbert Hoover will try to do in the midst of the Great Depression more than 3 decades later. Number two, the graduated income tax, the progressive income tax. So the more you make, the more you pay. Obviously, this is the law in the United States now. That will become the norm during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson in the 19-teens. Number three, postal savings banks. Again, these were to be government banks that could not fail, and therefore the deposits of the average person would be safe. Well, again, in the midst of the New Deal now, in 1933, this is Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, will be created, which is close to this idea of the postal savings banks. Number four, nationalize the railroads. In other words, the federal government would take over the railroads and the telephone companies, and they would then be treated as utilities and regulated so that the prices charged would be as low as possible and fair. During World War I, the government will indeed nationalize the railroads in order to make sure that supplies for the war could get to where they needed to be as quickly as possible. Now, after the war, the nationalization of the railroads will end and they will go back to private ownership. But you can see this idea was very important in American history. Number five, the 8-hour day for workers. To this day, Americans look to the 8-hour day, 5 days a week, as full employment. Well, the populists wanted the 8-hour day at this time. It wasn't the 8-hour day. People worked 10, 12 hours, 5.5, 6, even 7 days a week. There was very little regulation, none at the federal level. And so in 1916, the Adamson Act will be passed, and that will establish for railroad workers, which was the major transportation form at that time, the 8-hour day. And once that was done for railroad workers, then every other labor union and worker in America wanted the 8-hour day. And finally, number six, immigration restriction. Whoa, there's a topic we don't care about anymore today, right? Immigration? Yeah. So the idea behind immigration restriction then and now was that for those who believe in immigration restriction and so forth, is that if you restrict the flow of immigrants, then the people who are here already, Americans, their wages will rise. Now, this was even more true back in the day when so many American jobs were blue-collar jobs and didn't require an education and so forth. So if you restrict immigration, the idea again is that wages will rise for Americans. And this was true then because those who opposed immigration restriction were American capitalists. And by the way, American capitalists today oftentimes oppose immigration restriction. So we do get immigration restriction in 1924. Again, the populists were ahead of their time. Well, the Populist Party was the great new innovation of the 1892 election. Still, the populist candidate for president, a man by the name of James Weaver, General James Weaver, didn't get a whole lot of attention nationally. as most of the newspapers and so forth were not really enamored with the idea of this populist party, so don't give them any press, right? Of course, today we don't argue over who gets what kind of attention in our social media and on the national, yeah, obviously, that's not true either. So amazingly, although times do change, oftentimes the issues remain the same. The Populist Party then is going to field this candidate for president, but he frankly isn't going to have much of a chance because he's not getting a lot of attention. The battle was between Benjamin Harrison, who was the Republican president at this time, the election of 1892, and he's running obviously for re-election, and Grover Cleveland, who was a former Democratic president back in the 1880s. So here's a Trivial Pursuit question. The only person to be elected to the presidency twice, but not to serve consecutive terms. Grover Cleveland then is the Democratic nominee in 1892. The issue was the tariff. Cleveland is running on a lower tariff issue, and then the Republicans, of course, are the party of the high tariff. And Cleveland wins. So Grover Cleveland, unluckily as it turns out, becomes president of the United States in early 1893. But the populists, again, were encouraged because their candidate had taken 4 states out west. They'd taken Kansas, the breadbasket of the country, Kansas and Nebraska. They'd taken Idaho, where silver was the focal point of the mining interests. They'd taken Nevada, again, a silver state in the Rocky Mountains. And Colorado, guess what? Agriculture and silver in Colorado. And they believed that 4 more years to organize might make the difference for their candidate. And so bimetallism is still the central issue in the 1890s. That is, what is bimetallism? That is adding silver adding silver to the gold standard. So you'd have silver and gold, 2 metals that would allow then for an inflation of the currency. Grover Cleveland was a well-intended president who was unlucky to be president when the worst depression in American history struck in 1893. Up until the Great Depression of the 1930s, if an American said, you know, the Depression, it was this Depression of the 1890s that was being referenced. It's very helpful for students of history to get these economic collapses down as a reference point for history, and then you build your understanding of the history and the times based on these economic collapses. One does the same thing, of course, with the major wars like the Civil War or World War I. So I'm suggesting to you, understanding the economic history of the United States is crucial. Well, the Depression began even before Cleveland took office. It wasn't his fault. Again, he was just unlucky to be president when it struck. Herbert Hoover is going to have the same thing happen to him when he becomes president in 1929. It's not his fault. He's just unlucky. The Great Depression of the 1890s was initiated by the failure of the Philadelphia Reading Railroad. And then, of course, when that major railroad failed, it caused a panic on where? Wall Street. And once the money comes into question, then the banks are threatened with bankruptcy, and all American businesses may, in fact, go out of business. One never knows where the weakness lies or where the strength is for sure. Cleveland's policies, however, angered everybody. His lower tariff, of course, made business people mad. His antagonism to coining silver, which was fast becoming the cure-all in the minds of America's oppressed and of America's farmers, that alienated them. Cleveland was not on their side. He's an old-fashioned Democrat. And then his efforts to put down a strike, a working men's strike in the Pullman Railroad car strike of 1894, that made labor mad. So everybody hates Cleveland now in the midst of the Depression of the 1890s. This depression of the 1890s moved a writer by the name of L. Frank Baum. And you may not recognize the name, but you were going to recognize the book and, of course, later the movies. For Baum, then, in his novel, The Wizard of Oz, argued for free silver. He takes up the call of free silver in what became one of the most beloved novels and later films of all time. As I said, The Wizard of Oz. Now, the film wasn't made until 1939, again in the midst of the Great Depression of that decade. But the novel came out in this first of the Great Depressions. In the novel, Dorothy's ruby slippers are silver. Now, in the movie, they're changed to ruby because the red is so much more captivating in color. But these are silver slippers. And the message, of course, is symbolic. And the message is that silver slippers, the silver shoes, we can walk back, you see. These slippers will take us back to a time of prosperity for America's farmers. So, the silver slippers are crucial to understanding the economic distress and the message of The Wizard of Oz. Now, the film is more traditional in its message to Americans in the middle of the 1930s. The book is radical. Add silver to the money supply, create inflation, help America's oppressed. And while the film is not opposed to helping America's oppressed, it actually stresses the old-fashioned values of faith, hard work, and love. These are the things that will take us back home, not the federal government. Of course, in the novel, Baum is looking towards passage of legislation at the federal level that will take us back to prosperity. The film takes the opposite view. No, rely on yourself. Dorothy always has, in the film again, the ability to take herself back to Kansas, right? And what does she have? She has 3 friends who are going to take her back there, help her get back there. There's the Scarecrow, knowledge, wisdom. There's the Lion, courage. And then there's the Tin Man, the heart, love, right? These 3 American values that will take us back to the good times. Forget the federal government. Okay. So the novel and the film are rather at odds with one another. Well, be that as it may, we come then to one of the great figures in American history, one of my favorite Americans. And I love this man because, of course, he's an evangelical Christian and he lives his faith. In his spare time, when he was not acting as a politician, he was an evangelist on the Chautauqua or camp meeting tours and such. William Jennings Bryan. One might expect that the Depression would help the populists, but bad times make reformers of us all. And so the Depression backfired on the populists. The Democratic Party abandoned its gold standard in 1896, and they moved to the currency expansion of the populace. So the Democratic Party now is going to give up the gold standard and sound money, as it was called in those days, and they're going to adopt the silver platform of the populists. And so the populists then lost their main issue. They lost their main issue to the Democrats. So they have a choice to make. Are they going to run against a major political party that has already taken over their primary issue? Or are they going to join that party? The Republicans nominated William McKinley. So if you're the least bit familiar with American history, you know that William McKinley was a president of the United States. And so you know that the Republicans are going to win this election. They nominated William McKinley on the high tariff, gold standard policies of the past, the safe money policies, the so-called, and this is what the Republicans would say, the policies of morality, the policies of civilization. But who would represent the Democrats? You see, the party was reinventing itself. It was taking over the main cause of the populists. Perhaps it would need a new face in order to convince the populists that it was sincere. Perhaps it would need a new voice. One of the party's young stars, a great public speaker, a fine orator, if you will, was the aforementioned William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan, at the convention, the Democratic Party convention, maneuvered himself to give the speech that placed the silver platform before the convention. So the convention is going to vote on the silver platform, and Bryan wants to give the speech that would rouse the delegates to approve silver as part of the Democratic Party's platform. Bryan was the son of a judge, was raised in a devout Baptist home. He was from the heartland, the Corn Belt, Nebraska. The University of Nebraska, their nickname for their athletic teams, Cornhuskers. And the state immediately to the south is the wheat belt in America. So Kansas, wheat, Nebraska, corn, Iowa right next door, hogs, corn. This is the heartland of America. So Bryan understood then, being from Nebraska, the problems and more importantly, the perspectives of the common people. He's one of them. In fact, his nickname, frankly, and it's a nickname he valued, was the Great Commoner. He shared their faith. He had shared in their misfortune as well. He had served 2 terms in Congress in the early 1890s, but he lost his seat in 1894 when the Democrats, and he was a Democrat and a populist, were blamed for the Great Depression. So he was a Democrat with populist principles. So he'd been thrown out of Congress because of the Great Depression. So he had suffered with the people. Now he had a chance in 1896 to redeem himself and lead his party in a new direction, again, in the populist direction. Here's a great painting, by the way, of Bryan giving one of the most famous speeches in American history, the Cross of Gold speech, at the Democratic Convention in 1896. The Cross of Gold speech reads in part, "I come to you in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity. We have petitioned, and our petitions have been scorned. We have entreated, and our entreaties have been disregarded. We have begged, and we have been mocked. When our calamity came, we beg no longer. We entreat no more. We petition no more. We defy them. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." The Cross of Gold speech. The nomination for the presidency was Bryan's. The Democrats would carry the hopes of farmers and labor into the election of 1896. Populists then joined the Democratic cause. Surely the two together would be victorious, the Democrats and the populists. Unfortunately, the conservative wing of the Democratic Party, the Cleveland wing, could not abide this radicalism from the prairies. They could not accept Bryan's silver inflationary platform. And so the Cleveland wing of the party left the party, formed their own party. So the Democrats were fractured. The Republicans were not fractured. And by the way, some of those Democrats that left the party voted Republican. I want to read to you a selection from some of my work on Dwight Eisenhower. uh, selection that deals with the election of 1896. I think you might find this somewhat charming. And then there will be some repeat that might be helpful in explaining the issues of the day. Dwight Eisenhower, for those of you who do not know or do not remember, was from Abilene, Kansas, right in the heart of the country. The election of 1896 created great passion in the little towns and villages of America. One future president came from a family that was not intensely political. Though young Dwight Eisenhower became a political activist at the innocent age of 6. He was born in 1890, so it's the election of 1896. In 1896, the United States was just emerging from a 3-year depression that had ruined tens of thousands of farmers, hundreds of bankers, throwing millions of American workers out of their jobs. It was, to that time, the worst depression, the worst economic collapse in our nation's history. One of the primary problems was currency deflation, a dwindling supply of money that could not be corrected because the country's money supply was tied to gold, and there was only so much gold in the nation's vaults. Populism, which supported significant government aid to farmers, swept the prairies and farmlands like a grass fire in August, especially in the West and the South. The populists were particularly strong in Kansas. This is Mary Leese's home ground. Reformers also hoped to weld the working men of the city to the party by advocating the 8-hour day. Farmers wouldn't pay much attention to the 8-hour day. And nationalization of some of the utilities, again, railroads and so on, telephones. So that was intended to appeal to working men. Many Americans, even substantial numbers of farmers now, saw such radical ideas as an anathema, un-American. American values were individualism, not government aid, and hard work. By 1896, Democratic President Grover Cleveland could not maintain the support of his own party. The prairie radicals, the mining interests of the West, silver, large numbers of unemployed, they combined to back the Democratic nominee, William Jennings Bryan. They backed Bryan for the nomination of the Democratic Party, and then, of course, they were full-throated in their support of Bryan for the presidency. The discontent of the nation's economically deprived, the have-nots, was distilled into one issue. Now, again, there are many issues, but always in American politics, generally one issue comes to the fore. And that one issue was the coining of silver at the ratio of 16-1. Again, a highly inflationary ratio. This would add silver as a guarantor of the value of money. It would increase the money supply and thus reinflate the nation's currency. Now, just in case you're confused, today we don't even have a solid currency. We don't use the gold standard or the silver standard, or either one or any combination thereof. We simply print the amount of money we think is appropriate. So how much have times changed? But this was an inflationary program, and of course, if you are owed money, you want to be paid back with money that is equal to the value of the money you lent out, or perhaps even in a great world like it had been recently, you would be paid back with money that was more valuable. That would make you rich faster. So this inflationary program horrified most Republicans who believed that such manipulation of the gold standard would ruin the nation's banking system, would ruin the work ethic of working people and farmers, and perhaps end Western civilization. Well, it was, after all, a political campaign, and hyperbole is the rule of such moments. Republicans chose William McKinley to save the nation from the so-called unwashed masses, the populists, who have taken over the Democratic Party. What will happen if they take over the nation? And again, that term populist is still used at this time, right now, to describe uneducated people who who misunderstand the nation's economic issues. Young Eisenhower remember he's only 6 years old now, adults arguing vociferously about the issues in the campaign. Kansans were conflicted. Their economic interests would seem to mandate a vote for Bryan, there's no doubt about that. But their personal values, the way they were brought up and such, were traditional and much more Republican. One cannot say with certainty what Ike's father David's politics were in 1896. But given the failure of his general store in the 1880s, he was a small businessman, his store went bankrupt. After that, he became a working man, blue-collar labor. And then we know that in 1903, he was a socialist when he ran for Abilene School Board. By the way, this family denies that David Eisenhower was a socialist, but we have evidence from newspaper clippings and so forth. And we don't know that he remained a socialist the rest of his life, probably not, but there was a moment when he ran on the socialist ticket in a local election. So what I'm suggesting is, given these circumstances, is that in 1896, he was probably someone in Abilene who was going to vote for Bryan. We do know that he was a Democrat at one time or another, so I think I'm on pretty solid ground here. On the other hand, as children are wont to do, his 6-year-old son, Dwight, favored McKinley. Dwight was a Republican in 1896. Dwight favored McKinley if for no other reason than the Republicans were planning a torchlight parade for one October evening just before the election. So the Republicans of Abilene staged this extravaganza to drum up support for their man, McKinley. So this was going to be a parade in the fall, in the dark, down the main streets of Abilene with people carrying torchlights. It's quite the spectacle. And of course, this torchlight parade is designed to encourage Abilene citizens to vote for McKinley, save the gold standard, and again, save Western civilization. Dwight had 2 older brothers. He's the 3rd son. His oldest brother, Arthur, was 10, and then Edgar, 8. They anxiously awaited the great event. And Ike, just 6 years old, what do little brothers always want to do? They always want to tag along with their older brothers. But Ida, Dwight's mother, thought that her 6-year-old son, Dwight, was too young to go downtown. They lived on just the outskirts of the town. Too young to go downtown with the older brothers. Well, Arthur assured his mother that he would look after his little brother. It's very nice of Arthur to do this. Oftentimes older brothers, can't be bothered. So off the 3 of them went to see the festivities, the great torchlight parade. The wide-eyed brothers walked through the growing crowd along Buckeye Street, the main street, to the north end where the parade was being organized. North end of Abilene is the more wealthy end, the place where the Republicans would naturally live. And they were going to march from there to the downtown part of Abilene. By the way, the south end, where the Eisenhowers lived, the poor end of town. And just to meet the stereotype right head on, they lived across the railroad tracks. So they lived on the wrong side of the tracks. To their astonishment, the parade manager saw the boys and asked them if they would like to carry torches. Whoa! What boy could refuse the opportunity to carry a flaming stick through his hometown with many of his friends looking jealously on? Dwight's torch was as tall as he was. Nevertheless, he shouldered his flame like a rifle, and off he marched into the autumn evening. Young Ike well remembered the glorious event, and that he proudly wore an enormous McKinley button on his coat until after the election. There was a McKinley button of the day. No word as to whether this was actually the button that young Ike wore, but it was something like this. Now, Abilene gave the paraders a mixed reception. Ike remembered some disrespectful laughter. Kansas was so dependent upon farmers that Bryan and perhaps even a radical like Tom Watson were becoming popular in Abilene. Many farmers and their supporters wondered why their government could not help them against unscrupulous Eastern bankers, vicious world grain markets, ruthless middlemen, and of course, the ever monopolistic railroads. Wasn't it enough that a farmer had to battle the weather and voracious grasshoppers by himself? These thoughts flashed through the minds of farmers like summer lightning. But the Grand Old Party, the nickname of the Republicans, GOP, that's where that comes from. The Grand Old Party, by the 1890s, was dead fast in its support of the high tariff, free enterprise, and the gold standard that had so obviously made the United States an industrial and economic power. By 1896, even in the midst of this depression, the United States was the dominant industrial power in the world, having surpassed Great Britain. And so the Grand Old Party would not help farmers, would not help labor. So the people in the rural areas of Dickinson County is right in the center of Kansas, right where Abilene is. Indeed, most of the people of Kansas, overwhelmingly Protestant, Christian, and Kansas at this time is one of the most evangelical Christian states in the country, and is to this day. And overwhelmingly of Northern European stock. The Eisenhowers were German. They persevered. They worked hard. They prayed harder. And in the election of 1896, agricultural Kansas voted for William Jennings Bryan. The little hamlet of Abilene, however, and it's a very tiny town, maybe 5,000 population at this time, not much bigger today. Abilene voted for McKinley. So Dickinson County, like America, was divided along a rural-urban line. But Kansas, contrary to the beliefs and hopes of many, was not America. It's not symbolic of America. It's not symbolic of America because there are not enough big cities in Kansas, or Nebraska for that matter. And so who won this election? McKinley. It is not too much to say that in the election of 1896, metropolitan America, urban America, clashed with rural America in a great struggle to determine whose interests would control the nation's political machinery. The conflict was not new in America, and it was not going to go away. And anybody who is a student of both Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson will recognize that this conflict between a commercial industrial America, Hamilton's America, and a rural agricultural America, Jefferson's America, had begun at the very beginning of the Great Republic. And in various forms, it continues to this day. This is the summer of 2020. We look at a November election, in which the great cities will certainly vote one way, and the rest of the country, the great countryside, rural America, will probably vote another. And we will see how it turns out. So America is forever, perhaps, well, perhaps that's too much to say, but certainly throughout its history has been divided largely along these lines. Look at this map. This is the 1896 election. The 2020 election is going to look very, very similar to that. If the Republicans in 2020 take the upper Midwest there, they will win. For the Democrats, we'll certainly take the Northeast and then the Oregon, California, definitely Washington now, and some of the other states, right? But that map is not far off what we will have in 2020, unless there's a landslide one way or the other. And so the Republicans won, McKinley is president, and Democrats and populists are left to wonder that if they could not win in the midst of this great economic want, could they ever do so? The great commoner consoled his supporters that November and wondered if he should try again in 1900. Meanwhile, Republican campaign manager Mark Hanna, the man who had managed McKinley's campaign, telegraphed McKinley when victory was sure. He said, and this is one of the great quotes in American political history, he said, "God is in his heaven. All's right with the world." Western civilization, again to use hyperbole, has been saved from the great unwashed and illiterate masses. Interestingly, we've seen how many of the progressive ideas became law in the coming half century. But 57 years later, another Republican president would be asked to repeal much of that legislation when he became president in 1953. These were the reforms that took place, the progressive reforms that took place in the progressive era and during the New Deal of the 1930s. And this Republican president was expected to go along with the very conservative Congress to repeal these laws. And he absolutely refused to do so. That president was, of course, the little boy who had walked in the Torchlight Parade in 1896. Well, as we have seen, the fractured Democratic Party had little chance in 1896. Though the Democrats had changed policies, they were still blamed for the Great Depression. It was their man who had been president. That's the way it works. So the Republicans won easily. Now, that map that you're looking at right now doesn't look like the Republicans won easily, does it? No. In fact, you'd almost guess that the blue states were victorious. It's all about population, isn't it? Yeah. And so William McKinley became the new president. Well, what does it all mean? In the election of 1896, rural America, Thomas Jefferson's America, had faced Alexander Hamilton's urban and industrial America, and they had lost. The Republicans' inability to govern the nation in the interest of all Americans, rather than only its urban industrial component, would severely harm the nation as a whole, and of course, farmers. Worse, the Republicans would repeat this mistake in the 1920s and thus help propel the nation into the Great Depression. And by the way, if you're thinking, oh gosh, he hates the Republicans, I don't. And I could give several other lectures that would castigate the Democrats for their mistakes. So this is my best understanding of this history at this time, though. And I think that's all you can ask of me, is to give it my best objective thought. Though the Civil War had put the nation physically back together, no president since Lincoln and no party had been able to govern the nation for the benefit of all. And even though the nation was divided during Lincoln's presidency and would not have understood what I've just said, I do think Lincoln tried to govern in the interests of all. The great man had said before he became president in 1861, "A house divided cannot stand." A great crash was coming in large part because the house was still divided. Now I do refer to the Great Depression of the 1930s. It's going to take a while to get here. Meanwhile, the election of 1896 and the farm problem gave rise to a new star, William Jennings Bryan. He became the leading spokesman for a more progressive America. He helped reshape the Democratic Party as Americans responded to his strong Christianity. Yes, evangelical Christianity at this time is the party of reform. And they responded to his deep concern for human beings. Bryan was a model for America and for Christians. He was, and now I'm using the title from the best book on William Jennings Bryan, the best biography, he was a godly hero. Well, I thank you for your attention for this lecture and, of course, for this semester. I pray for you. I pray that you have understood what I've said and the messages I've tried to get across in explaining this era of the Civil War. As always, don't hesitate to send me emails, and I will answer them as thoroughly and as well as I can if you are confused. But again, God bless you, and thank you.